I still remember the first day I walked into the glass tower of Blue Peak Systems in downtown Austin. The air inside was always 5 degrees colder than outside, just enough to make newcomers shiver, even in the middle of Texas July. They called it the ideal temperature for servers. I called it the company's way of testing how much discomfort new hires could handle. I'm Ella Grant, 27, a data analyst. My desk sat in the farthest corner, the kind of place people only pass by when the printer ran out of paper. On paper, I was a junior data analyst. In reality, I was the one cleaning up every system error someone else had ignored. Monday mornings, I was usually the first to arrive. The fluorescent lights flickered weakly, and the air still smelled faintly of stale coffee. I booted up my machine, listening to the fan whir like a tired sigh. Red error rows filled the screen. Another spreadsheet gone wrong because someone accidentally changed a formula. I took a slow breath, sipped my instant coffee, and started patching each line of data like stitching up an old coat that had already seen too many winters. The company ran like an orchestra where everyone played their own tune. Brad, my direct manager, was the self appointed conductor. He had a talent for appearing right when someone finished the hardest task just to say, "Great work, team," then CC the executive board. I used to joke silently that if there were an Oscar for Best Supporting Actor in taking credit, Brad would win by a landslide. Still, I believed in doing my part right. When a major client system crashed, I stayed up past midnight restoring the data. When a coworker forgot to run a script, I took care of it myself so the whole team wouldn't be penalized. I didn't expect praise. I just thought I was building a career. But over time, I realized that career felt more like fixing someone else's roof while I stood in the rain. One day, I passed by the glass meeting room where the executives were discussing the renewal of corporate culture. They talked about intrinsic motivation while the assistant brought in more pastries. All I could think about was my paycheck, unchanged since the day I signed my contract. That afternoon, Brad stopped by my desk with his usual friendly manager smile. "Ella, I'll need you to cover an extra shift this weekend. The client wants a data inventory check." I replied, "Sure, if the company counts it as overtime." Brad chuckled. "Come on. You know at Blue Peak we work for passion, not for money." I smiled back, not because it was funny, but because I realized something. Passion doesn't pay rent. By nightfall, the office was empty. Only the hum of the vents and the flicker of screens remained. I stared at the code I'd just fixed and wondered how many people in this building even knew what I did. Probably none. But if the system crashed tomorrow, they'd sure know my name, just to blame me. Another afternoon, while the team gossiped about Brad's vacation plans, an urgent email came in. The client couldn't access their sales data due to an integration error. I dove straight in. Within 2 hours, everything was back online. Brad walked out of the break room, glanced at the monitor, and said, "Perfect." I told everyone not to panic. He immediately sent a report. "Issue resolved under my supervision." I looked at that line and sighed. Apparently, under my supervision meant while I was eating a sandwich. That night, when I finally left, I caught my reflection in the office window, city lights shimmering over my keyboard. I didn't feel proud. I just felt tired. Tired of working hard in silence. Tired of constantly proving my worth to people who never listened. I stopped at the door, took a deep breath, and thought, maybe it's time to stop waiting for others to recognize me. Maybe it's time to let results speak for themselves. I didn't know that this small thought would set off a chain of events that would change my life completely. I left the building close to midnight. The city was still awake, as if no one wanted to rest. Headlights streaked across the highway, flashing white against the office glass before disappearing. If you've ever worked late, you probably know the feeling. Being surrounded by people, yet everyone rushing back to their own world. I don't know where you're listening from, on your commute, stuck in traffic, or in a city colder than Austin. But I bet you've had nights like that too. Nights when you ask yourself, who am I really doing all this for, and does anyone even notice? I used to ask myself the same thing. The only difference is that night, I decided I'd never let that question echo in my mind again. That morning, Austin was wrapped in a thin veil of fog. The rain had just stopped, and puddles still shimmered on the pavement. I stood in front of the glass building of Blue Peak Systems, watching people rush by, faces buried in phones or coffee cups. Everyone looked busy, urgent, like the company itself, always moving, always loud, but never really seeing what was right in front of them. In my hand was a stack of documents so thick the binder clip had started to bend. I'd spent a week preparing for this meeting with HR, not to demand anything, just to present things clearly. The projects I'd completed, the systems I'd fixed, the clients I'd supported after hours. All I wanted was acknowledgement. Maybe because some part of me still believed that if you spoke with reason, people would listen. The HR office was on the fourth floor, at the end of a long hallway flooded with white light. Every step echoed like the ticking of a distant clock. When I knocked, a familiar voice called out, calm and rehearsed. Come in. Karen Madsen, head of human resources, looked up from her screen. Her hair was softly curled, her makeup flawless, her smile even more so. I sat down across from her, hearing the faint roll of her chair wheels on the floor, a small sound that seemed to stretch the silence. Hi, Ella. What brings you in today? Her voice was soft, almost too soft. I opened the file and slid it across the desk. I'd like to review my workload over the past year and request a compensation review. Karen glanced down, flipped through the first few pages, her eyes skimming fast, as if just checking that the papers were real. The company really appreciates your hard work, she said. But current policy doesn't allow salary negotiations for junior positions. You understand that, don't you? A chill ran down my spine, not from the air conditioning. I'd heard those words too many times. Policy. A word that could end any conversation before it truly began. I kept my tone steady. I understand, but most of the current processes were redesigned by me. Our main client even sent a thank you letter naming me personally. I just thought the company could acknowledge that. Karen looked up, her head slightly tilted, her smile still perfectly in place. Exactly, and that's why you have this opportunity here. But sometimes humility is what helps us go further. We shouldn't focus too much on ourselves. I heard myself let out a quiet laugh, a thin sound, not really out of amusement. Humility. In her world, that word meant knowing when to stay silent while others took the credit. She went on about team spirit and shared culture. Buzzwords rolled off her tongue like lines from a training manual. I nodded, not interrupting. In my mind, I saw those long nights alone in front of my screen, stacks of error data piling up while Brad, my manager, sent glowing progress reports to leadership. I hadn't complained. Thought one day they'd notice. Now I realized they had noticed. They just didn't see a reason to say it out loud. Is there anything else you'd like to discuss? Karen asked, her tone as light as if this were a simple administrative check. I looked at her for a few seconds. No, thank you. I think I understand the company policy now. She nodded, her smile widening. Good. Keep up the good work, Ella. Blue Peak needs people like you. I gathered my papers and stood up. The HR door closed behind me with a sound like metal sealing off an old chapter. On the way back to my desk, I passed the main conference room. Through the glass, I saw Brad standing in front of a presentation screen. My charts and graphs filled the slides. He spoke confidently, laser pointer in hand, flashing his winning smile. People nodded. I stood there for a moment, then walked away. Not because I was hurt, but because I finally understood something. You can't expect recognition from people who refuse to look. By afternoon, the clouds had cleared and sunlight filled the office. I sat alone, eyes fixed on the data sheet. A small error flashed. Customer data duplicated, same timestamp, same user ID. An anomaly I'd never seen before. I opened a few more logs, my heartbeat quickening. Something wasn't right. Instead of reporting it, I saved everything in a separate folder and named it Pending Review. That night, long after the lights were out, I was still at my desk. The blue glow from the monitor cast light on my hands, my face. The building was silent, only the air vents humming softly. I remembered Karen's words, "Humility will take you far." I shook my head. Maybe she was right. Just not in the way she thought. I wasn't going far in their shadow. I shut down my computer and packed my bag. Outside, the morning rain had left a damp scent of earth and mist in the air. I stepped out of the building feeling strangely calm. The anger had faded, replaced by clarity. No need to argue, no need to prove, just wait. Because truth, like data, always leaves a trace. After that meeting, I stopped waiting for performance reviews. Something inside me had shifted. Not anger, but clarity. I still came to the office every day, made my coffee, turned on my computer, and answered emails. The only difference was that, for the first time, I started to observe instead of just working. Blue Peak loved to brag about its intelligent data structure, but I knew what hid beneath those polished dashboards: layers of patched up errors. The quarterly reports always looked spotless because people like me quietly cleaned up the mess before anyone could notice. So I started keeping records of everything: dates, times, error types, who approved, who patched temporarily, who claimed success. I didn't do it for revenge. I just wanted to understand exactly what I was holding in my hands. Once, when Brad asked why I kept so many backups, I smiled and said, "Data is like memory. If someone forgets, at least there's a place to look it up." He laughed, thinking it was a joke. The more I reviewed, the stranger it became. The same errors kept reappearing, following a pattern. Same client, same integration team, same final approver, Miles, the technical director. I couldn't tell if it was a coincidence or a habit. Sometimes, buried in lines of endless code, I felt like I was reading the company's diary: fragments of mistakes, rushed notes, patches on top of patches. It made me both sympathetic and curious. I still remember that Friday night. Everyone had left. Only the steady hum of the air conditioner and the pale glow of screens remained. I opened an old log file and a line popped up: duplicate transaction detected, flag ignored by admin override. I froze. The word ignored made my skin prickle. I traced the command chain and found that an internal account had manually removed a warning to complete a transaction. It wasn't a technical glitch, it was a human choice. I saved a copy to my personal drive, encrypted it, and closed everything. Part of me felt afraid, not of being caught, but of seeing too much. The next day, I worked as usual. Brad bragged to the team about the executive's confidence in our system, while Karen from HR sent a cheerful birthday email reminding everyone that a smile is our greatest asset. I read it and chuckled softly. At Blue Peak, it seemed everything had a slogan, except the truth. I built a new habit for myself. Every time I found an anomaly, I saved two versions: one for work, one for memory. No one knew, no one asked. I did it patiently, like someone assembling a puzzle, waiting for the picture to reveal itself. At night, I sat in a small cafe near my apartment, watching the stream of Austin traffic outside. On my laptop, I compiled the list of irregularities: 37 ignored errors, 7 instances of duplicated client data, and 12 admin accounts with overlapping permissions. Each line was a fragment of a larger picture I wasn't ready to name. I thought about Karen's words: humility will take you far. Maybe she was right. My humility was taking me further than she imagined, just not in the direction she hoped. On Sunday, I called an old friend, Lena, who now worked at a logistics firm. We'd known each other since college. I asked a few casual questions about her current project and its software vendors. When she mentioned Blue Peak, her voice dipped slightly. "Everything okay over there? We've been having constant issues with your data gateway. We've had to pull reports manually, sent several support requests, but no one ever replies." I stayed silent. On the other end, Lena laughed softly. "Sorry, guess I'm ranting. Anyway, thanks for listening." After the call, I sat there for a long time. Maybe I just realized that the small bugs I fixed every day weren't just internal issues. They affected clients, people like Lena, who only wanted the system to work so they could get home earlier. From that day on, I decided to do one more thing. Alongside my technical logs, I started writing everything in human language. Not just the code, but the context, the consequences, and the fixes. I wanted to build a real map of this maze so that one day, if needed, someone could see the whole picture. I still went to work, still smiled at my coworkers. Only now, each smile carried a different meaning. I was done waiting to be recognized. I was preparing for myself. At the end of the month, Blue Peak hosted a team celebration: neon lights, laughter, a cake with the words, "Together we build the future." I stood in the corner, holding a glass of water, watching Brad pose for photos with the executives. When someone asked why I wasn't joining in, I said, "I'm building my future too, just not here." That night, when I got home, I opened my laptop and created a folder for all my files. I named it Future Map. It sounded like a joke, but I knew it wasn't. I was drawing a real map, a quiet map leading me out of this place. May in Austin is usually humid, heavy with the smell of rain. In the mornings, sunlight filters through the windows, casting a pale gold layer over the glass towers like a thin coat of paint. And there I was, still at the same desk in the Blue Peak office, looking out at the parking lot where the oak trees were shedding their leaves too early. Everything around me seemed unchanged: the same clicking of keyboards, the same ringing phones, the same coffee machine chatter about vacations and long term vision projects. Only I had changed. Every time I opened a datasheet, I no longer saw lifeless numbers. I saw stories untold and gaps I knew shouldn't stay covered by silence forever. I still worked hard. No one noticed that I'd quietly begun organizing for myself, sorting files, backing up technical logs, completing my list of anomalies. I didn't yet know what I would do with them, only that someday they would matter. One afternoon, as I was checking my email, a LinkedIn notification popped up. "You've been mentioned in a post." I clicked. Under a post by an old client, someone had commented, "If it hadn't been for the person who fixed our system last month, our contract would have fallen apart. Thank you so much, Ella Grant." I smiled as I read it. It was from the logistics company that had faced a major data issue, the one I'd quietly helped fix after hours. I never thought they'd remember. A week later, I got a private message from someone named Andrew Keller, senior analyst at Veridian Logistics. It was short: "We're conducting an internal audit. Your name appeared in last year's system report. Would you be open to an informal conversation?" I reread it several times, thinking. I didn't reply right away, but that evening, at home, I opened my Future Map folder. Maybe this was a part of the map I hadn't seen yet. 3 days later, we met at a small cafe downtown. Andrew was in his early 40s, tall, with a steady voice. He didn't ask much, just mentioned that Veridian's data system was still facing the same recurring errors as last year. "I think someone from Blue Peak fixed it once, right?" I nodded, explaining briefly how I'd handled the issue. He listened carefully, took notes, then looked at me with a half smile. "Ever thought you might belong on the client side more than the vendors?" That line followed me into the night. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling fan spinning overhead, thinking about my job. For years, I believed loyalty was a virtue, but now I understand. Loyalty doesn't mean staying in a place that refuses to see you. A few days later, Andrew emailed, officially: "Veridian would like to invite you to interview for the position of Lead Data Integrity Specialist." Reading that felt like opening a door I'd been knocking on for years. I didn't tell anyone at Blue Peak. I just printed a new resume. Honest, simple, no embellishment. What I'd done was already enough. The interview took place in a bright, modest office, organized, logical, like the data tables I loved. The interviewer, Rachel and Gwen, director of analytics, spoke little but asked deeply. I answered truthfully, even about my limits. When it ended, she said, "We need someone who understands the value of transparency. I think you do." 2 weeks later, the offer arrived. A clean, direct contract. No grand promises. Salary, twice current. Role, Lead Data Integrity Specialist. I read every line, not out of doubt, but emotion. For the first time, I felt seen, not for my title, but for my work. On my last day at Blue Peak, I came in early, as always. No one noticed as I packed my things: a small plant, a few notebooks, a gray ceramic mug. Brad was busy on the phone, and Karen was sending out a reminder about the upcoming team building weekend. I looked at my inbox, smiled, and shut down my laptop. As I stepped outside, the wind carried that familiar scent of rain. I didn't look back. Ahead, sunlight broke through the oak branches, scattering across the wet pavement. I felt lighter, as if I'd finally put down a suitcase I'd carried too long. On my first day at Veridian, they showed me to my new desk, right by the window overlooking Austin's Central Park. Andrew stopped by and said with a grin, "Welcome to a place where data is treated fairly." I smiled. "I hope so, and I'll make sure of it." That afternoon, during our first team meeting, Rachel announced, "Next quarter, we'll be conducting a vendor audit. Blue Peak Systems is on the priority list." The room fell silent for a few seconds. I sat still, feeling my heartbeat slow, not from fear, but from recognition. My journey had come full circle. No bitterness, no drama, just a fitting coincidence, a chance to prove my worth in a place that valued fairness. That night, I left the office late. The city glowed under the streetlights. I looked down at my new ID badge hanging around my neck, my name printed clearly. Ella Grant, Lead Data Integrity Specialist. A simple line of text, but to me, it was the answer to every silence that came before. By my second week at Veridian, I'd already settled into the rhythm. No one asked me to stay late, and no one handed out fake praise. People only cared about one thing: data. Was it accurate? Verifiable? Could it be explained? For the first time, I felt like I'd found my own language. On a Monday morning, Rachel called me into the meeting room. The whiteboard was crowded with names of vendors, notes in red and blue. In the top corner, I spotted a familiar line: Blue Peak Systems. "This quarter, we're auditing 3 partners," Rachel said. "Blue Peak is the priority. Their system's showing sync errors, and I need someone who understands how they operate." She looked at me, not as a command, but as a question. "What do you think, Ella?" "I know their structure," I said simply. "I can help." "Good," she nodded. "You'll lead this team, follow the process. Transparent, no bias." I left the room holding a thick file, feeling the weight of it, but not fear. Blue Peak no longer had the power to make me tremble. It was just another system to be audited. My first task was to draft the audit plan, define the scope, checkpoints, and potential risks. My team and I began digging through client data, transaction logs, and API connections. Each line of code pulled me back to those long nights at Blue Peak: the white light, the hum of the vents, the solitude. Only this time I was looking from the other side of the wall. At noon, Andrew stopped by with a fresh cup of coffee. "You doing okay? I know this one's not easy." "I'm fine," I smiled. "Just strange, auditing a place I used to work." He nodded. "You're the only one who understands them from the inside. Think of it as helping both sides do better." His words eased me. I didn't want this to feel like payback. I wanted it to be repaired. That afternoon, we pulled the archived logs. Some files were misencoded and others had missing entries. I showed the team how to recover the data, and slowly, fragments began to reappear. Lines of numbers scrolled across the screen like living memories. When I saw my name listed under Updated By, I froze. I remembered that night, patching the system so a client wouldn't lose service. Now that same line stood as proof that I'd once tried to save a system already falling apart. The days that followed blurred into steady focus. Every morning, I arrived early, opened the window, and let the sunlight spill across the keyboard. Outside, the city buzzed. Inside, we quietly pieced data back together. The deeper we went, the clearer the pattern: duplicate permissions, unchecked approvals, mismatched security reports. No one said it out loud, but we all knew. Blue Peak needed a full rebuild. Late one evening, Rachel called. Her voice was calm but precise. "Ella, I reviewed your draft. Excellent work. Next week, we're meeting with Blue Peak to go over preliminary findings. You'll lead it." I paused for a second. "All right, I'll be ready." After the call, I stayed at my desk, staring at my notes, feeling both calm and alive. I didn't want to prove anything to them. I just wanted to prove to myself that I could stay steady in front of people who once made me doubt my worth. The meeting came sooner than expected. The glass conference room on Veridian's 13th floor gleamed in the morning light. When Blue Peak's representatives walked in, I recognized the faces: Brad, Miles, and Karen. They didn't notice me right away. They probably never imagined that the junior analyst from years ago would be sitting at the head of the table. Rachel gave a short introduction. This is Ella Grant, lead data integrity specialist, overseeing the project. The room went still for a moment. Brad blinked. Miles cleared his throat, and Karen smiled politely. I just nodded and started the presentation. I spoke about audit methodology, metrics, verification protocols, nothing personal, just facts. My voice was steady, deliberate, and paced so everyone could follow. When I finished, I moved to the recommendations. Everything supported by data, no judgment attached. We believe these adjustments will help stabilize and secure your system, I said. Rachel closed the session. The Blue Peak team thanked us and promised follow-up materials. As they left, I watched them go, not with satisfaction or anger, but a quiet sense of closure, like sealing a file that is no longer needed reopening. That evening, I left the office late. The Austin sky had turned soft lavender, the air carrying the faint scent of wildflowers. Standing on the sidewalk, I took a long breath. My mind wasn't replaying Blue Peak anymore. It was filled with plans for what came next: building a more transparent evaluation system, teaching junior analysts how to document their changes, rewriting reporting processes so no one would ever go unseen the way I once was. For the first time in years, the future didn't feel like a dark road waiting for someone else to turn on the lights. I was holding the light myself, guiding every step. 3 days after the meeting, the Veridian office buzzed with keyboard clicks and quick conversations. Everyone was busy finalizing the audit summary. I thought things had settled down. But in this industry, calm often just means a thin layer of dust covering an undercurrent. That afternoon, Andrew hurried over to my desk, a folder in his hand. Ella, he said quietly, Blue Peak just sent a response. They're claiming our preliminary report contains inaccuracies. I looked up. Inaccuracies where? Not specific, they just said, the data may have been misinterpreted, possibly due to confusion from personnel previously employed at Blue Peak. I understood instantly. Personnel previously employed at Blue Peak, that meant me. I took a deep breath and opened in the email. The language was polite, almost sterile. We are concerned that the involvement of a former employee in the audit process could create a conflict of interest. No accusation, but enough to plant doubt. That night, I stayed after everyone had gone home. The office lights reflected off the metal desk, and the soft blue glow of the screen filled the quiet room. I opened every log, every data sheet, every verification step. Everything was accurate. There was no room for misinterpretation. I drafted an email to Rachel. I'd like to re-verify all audit data with the legal team present, not to defend myself, but to protect the integrity of our process. She replied almost immediately, I trust you. Do it. The next morning, the 12th floor conference room was full: legal, audit, and Rachel herself. I walked them through the entire process, displaying every verification step, every timestamp. No gaps, no ambiguity. When I finished, the room was silent. An older lawyer nodded. Everything checks out. No revisions necessary. Rachel smiled faintly. Then we'll send an official response. Calm, factual, no hostility. For 3 days, Blue Peak stayed silent. But I knew they weren't done. I used to work there. I knew their playbook. They never attacked head-on. They spread doubt. Sure enough, by the weekend, an anonymous post appeared on an industry forum. A partner company hires a former employee to audit. Where's the professional ethics? No names mentioned, but anyone reading could guess who it was about. Andrew called. You okay? We can request a takedown. No need, I said. Rumors die on their own when truth is bright enough. So I stayed silent and kept working. My focus would be on my answer. I spent 3 nights completing the final report: technical evidence, verification steps, and system improvement proposals. Not a single line about me, only data and solutions. When Rachel reviewed it, she said, This doesn't just clear any doubt, it shows exactly why I hired you. Calm, precise, never personal. I smiled. Sometimes data is the best defense a person can have. A week later, Blue Peak sent an official letter agreeing with the audit findings. The tone was neutral. Thank you, Veridian, for your assistance in verification. We will review the recommendations. No apology, of course, but I didn't need one. Truth doesn't need apology, it only needs acknowledgement. That afternoon, as I left the office, I saw Karen stepping out of a taxi in front of the building. She was probably meeting the partnership team. The wind caught her hair. Her polite smile was exactly as I remembered. She spotted me, paused briefly, then smiled again. Ella, what a surprise! You must be keeping busy these days. I nodded, voice even. Same as always. The difference is, data gets heard now. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Good. Blue Peak's learning that too. I said nothing. Some stories don't need closure through words, only through the distance that time creates. As she walked away, disappearing into the stream of cars, I watched her go. Not with satisfaction, but with quiet resolution. Everything I needed to say had already been said through my work. That night, I opened my laptop and added a line to my work log. When they doubt you, don't explain with words. Prove it with precision. Outside, Austin was glowing with city lights. I took a sip of cold coffee and caught my reflection in the screen. Steady, clear, and no longer afraid of the shadows behind me. After the storm, it seemed everything had finally quieted down. Blue Peak had officially confirmed the audit results, but I knew better. Reports were only the surface. Beneath those layers of data, there were still stories untold. Veridian decided to expand the audit scope to include 3 subsidiary systems, aiming to understand the full picture of the supply chain. I was assigned to lead the technical analysis team. The goal wasn't to prove Blue Peak wrong anymore, but to rebuild the data flow so the same mistakes wouldn't happen again. It was complex work, and I loved every detail of it. On the first morning of the project, I walked into the meeting room with a steaming cup of coffee. The big screen displayed the system diagram stretched like a dense highway map. My team was debating bottlenecks and overlapping data routes. I listened for a while before saying, "Don't look at the errors, look at the flow. Data is like water. When it flows the wrong way, the errors are just symptoms." For a moment, everyone went silent, then nodded. We redrew the map from the ground up, not patching holes, but redesigning how everything moved. The days that followed were consumed by numbers. Every morning, I arrived early, playing soft jazz as my fingers fell into rhythm with the keys. Every night, I sat before the screen, watching lines of logs roll by like a river telling its story. Sometimes I stumbled across my own name in the author fields of old code. It felt like meeting a past version of myself, the one who had tried so hard to keep a failing system alive, unnoticed and unremembered. Now, I didn't need to be remembered. I just needed to do it right. Then came the unexpected. Veridian's system detected a small data discrepancy between the central warehouse and the eastern branch. The deviation was minor, less than 0.5%, but enough to offset the supply chain. Operations suspected it originated from the legacy protocols Blue Peak had developed. Rachel called me. Ella, I need you to trace the source. Is it a technical error or interference? I knew this wasn't small. If the first audit had proven my capability, this one would test my composure. I opened the database and started tracing connections. Some files had altered timestamps. Some logs were missing edit histories. Signs of human intervention. Someone trying to clean up the trail. That night, I didn't go home. The white ceiling lights reflected off my empty coffee mug. The monitor blinked like a heartbeat. I built a trace model and gradually restored the missing logs. By dawn, one username appeared. Admin Proxy BPS. 3 familiar letters. Blue Peak Systems. I sent my report to Rachel at 7 in the morning, attaching all technical evidence. An hour later, she walked into my office with a fresh cup of coffee. You're sure? I'm not saying it was intentional, I said, but their system is sending incorrect data, and someone knows. She nodded. Good. Prepare for the executive meeting this afternoon. The meeting room was bright, every light on. On the big screen, I projected the connection diagram, red arrows tracing from Veridian to Blue Peak. Here, I said, pointing to an outdated protocol. The data overwrote without confirmation logs. The result is inventory numbers that don't match reality. A finance director frowned. How do we know this isn't our system's fault? I met his gaze, steady. If it were Viridian's fault, I'd have fixed it weeks ago. But these timestamps align with an external update from Bluepeak through a temporary access token from last year. It's not a coincidence. The room fell silent. Rachel spoke. What Ella's saying is that Bluepeak never closed its old access permissions. Their system is still interfering with our data flow. We need to decide how to proceed. After a brief discussion, the conclusion was clear: a full cross-check audit between both sides. I was assigned as Viridian's technical representative. When the decision was announced, I didn't feel relief or dread, just resolve. This was my chance to close a loop that had been open for years. 3 days later, the cross-check began. My team and I spent hours in the server room, monitoring each packet of data traveling between the two systems. On the other end, Bluepeak's engineers did the same. Through the video feed, I saw familiar faces: Brad, Miles. They avoided my eyes, keeping their exchanges brief. When the comparison finished, the results were clear. The discrepancies came directly from Bluepeak's legacy protocols. No security validation, no audit trail. No one spoke. The data said everything. Afterward, Rachel sent me a short message. You did great. No noise, just precision. That's how professionals win. I stared at the message for a while. Maybe this was the data battle I was meant to fight. Not for victory, but to restore fairness to the work I'd once believed in. That night, I walked home under a light Austin rain. The air smelled of damp earth and jasmine. I thought back to the day I first left Bluepeak, carrying a small box of my things. Now I carried nothing but peace. I finally understood. I wasn't fighting anyone. I was standing with the truth. Under the streetlights, raindrops cooled my wrist. I smiled to myself and whispered, "Sometimes silence has a sound, the sound of accuracy." The last week of June arrived blazing hot in Austin. Sunlight streamed through Viridian's glass walls, scattering across the cold steel table where I sat reviewing the final report. On the screen, hundreds of lines of data stood in perfect alignment, like soldiers waiting for their final command. I checked everything a third time, then looked up. It was lunch hour. The office was quiet except for the steady hum of the printer. It felt like I was sitting in the calm before a courtroom, only this time, the trial was made of data. That afternoon, the Joint Audit Council convened. Representatives from both Viridian and Bluepeak were present, along with an independent legal observer. They would review every result and decide the future of the partnership contract. When I entered the room, I could feel the heaviness in the air. At the head of the table sat Rachel and Andrew for Viridian. Across from them were Brad and Miles from Bluepeak, their faces tense. In the center of the table, a large screen displayed Final Audit Presentation, Viridian and Bluepeak. Systems. Rachel glanced at me. Ella, go ahead. I stood and opened the first slide. My voice carried clearly through the silence. I'll summarize the findings from the joint data review. We analyzed 4.8 million records, cross-checked 27 data streams, and 16 integration protocols. The conclusion: 92% of systems performed as expected. The remaining 8% were affected by outdated security protocols originating from Bluepeak. On the screen, graphs shifted slowly, blue and red bars overlapping. These protocols, I continued, don't pose immediate risk, but they create cumulative discrepancies across the supply chain. That's what caused the 0.5% deviation in the Eastern warehouse. A Bluepeak representative leaned forward, his voice tight. Can you guarantee your results aren't biased by the fact that you once worked for us? That question, I'd been expecting it. Yes, I said evenly. Every result was verified by Viridian's independent technical and legal teams. And if anything, my time at Bluepeak helps me understand what your system needs to improve. The room fell still for a few seconds. Then Rachel nodded slightly, as if confirming what didn't need to be said. I continued to the recommendations: two-factor authentication updates, mandatory logging, and a cross-company validation channel. Each proposal came with technical models and projected costs. No blame, no dramatics, only solutions. When the final slide closed, I said, "We're not here to end this by finding fault. We're here to prevent it from happening again. When data is respected, it protects everyone who works with it." The room stayed silent. The air conditioner hummed softly. I saw Rachel smile faintly, while Brad lowered his eyes to the papers in front of him. The meeting lasted nearly 3 hours. When every argument had been exhausted, the independent legal representative stood and read the decision. The Veridian report is validated. Audit results are confirmed. Blue Peak is responsible for updating legacy protocols and must suspend new deployments until remediation is complete. No applause, just a collective exhale. The data war was over. No victors, only clarity. After the meeting, as I packed up my files, Rachel walked over. "Ella, you did something not everyone dares to do. Protect the truth without wounding anyone. I'm proud of you." I smiled. "I only did what was right. Data is fair, it just takes courage to read it." By late afternoon, the office had emptied. I lingered a while, watching the last sunlight spill across the whiteboard, turning it gold. It felt like watching my own journey unfold, from the girl hidden in a corner to the woman standing in the light without needing to raise her voice. On the table lay the final report, Veridian's logo stamped neatly in the corner. I turned the cover and wrote a single pencil line. "Fairness isn't punishment. It's light shining where it belongs." When I stepped out of the room, Brad was waiting in the hallway. He looked uneasy. "Ella, you really did great." "Thanks," I said quietly. "Good luck with the improvements ahead." No resentment, no triumph. Just two people who once walked the same path, now moving in different directions. That night at home, I brewed a cup of tea and opened the window. Austin glowed outside, the sound of traffic blending with soft jazz from a nearby bar. I felt an unfamiliar peace, not because I'd won, but because everything, finally, was clear. A month after the ruling, Veridian officially terminated its contract with Blue Peak. The internal announcement was short and clinical. Due to non-compliance with security standards, Blue Peak systems will be replaced by a new vendor. No drama, no headlines, just a few lines, cold as white paper. But I knew, for Blue Peak, it was an earthquake. 3 days later, an email arrived from Rachel. "They've requested a final handover meeting. You'll attend as Veridian's representative." I read the line several times, my fingers brushing the rim of my coffee cup. The heat spread across my skin, not nerves, just the quiet awareness of a circle about to close. The meeting was held in Veridian's main conference room with glass walls overlooking downtown Austin. I arrived early, opened my laptop, and prepared the slides. Sunlight reflected off the steel table. In the glass, I caught my own reflection, calm, steady, eyes that no longer looked away. Then they walked in. Karen Madsen, the former HR head, who once smiled and told me, "Juniors don't negotiate." Brad, the same manager with his hands in his pockets, scanning the room for someone to command. They were joined by two legal representatives. Rachel greeted them politely, then gestured toward me. "This is Ella Grant, Veridian's Director of Data Transparency. She'll lead today's session and finalize personnel matters." Karen froze. For a second, confusion flickered in her eyes. Not fear, just the realization that she no longer knew which side of the table I stood on. I smiled slightly. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Madsen. It's been a while." My voice was calm, not sharp, not cold, but enough to draw silence across the room. The handover began. I went through the API systems, authentication records, and compliance archives. Everything ran smoothly until the last section, the personnel evaluation. I opened a new slide. Assessment of Blue Peak's contract team, performance and compliance. Karen straightened in her chair as if sensing what was coming. "After review," I said evenly, "Veridian has found multiple violations in your personnel approval process. No credential verification, unsupervised system logins, and failure to report data discrepancies in time. These breaches directly impacted the contract." I paused briefly, then continued, still in the same steady tone. "As a result, individuals directly responsible for the previous HR process will have their cooperation terminated, effective upon completion of this handover. The room went still. Karen stared at me, lips parted but voiceless. Brad leaned forward, starting, "Wait, this?" I turned to him, still composed. "Brad, I know what you're about to say, but every decision here has already been legally vetted. My role is simply to ensure the process is followed, accurately and in full." One of Viridian's lawyers slid a document across the table. "Termination agreement. Please, sign." Karen's hand trembled. The pen clicked against the metal surface with a faint, painful sound. She signed, then looked up at me. "Ella," she said softly, voice hoarse, "I never thought you'd come this far." I smiled gently. "Neither did I. But maybe when you keep doing what's right, the path opens on its own." No one said another word. The meeting ended in silence. As they left, the afternoon sun cast a long, pale shadow behind Karen, a fading echo of old arrogance dissolving into the floor. That evening, I didn't feel triumphant, or even relieved, just still. I stood by my office window, watching the city glow beneath the dusk. There was no hatred left, only a quiet understanding. Mistakes always come with a cost, but not everyone has the patience to wait for justice to arrive. My phone buzzed. A message from Rachel. "It's done. Blue Peak has withdrawn. Thank you for keeping everything measured." Not many could have done that without letting emotion take over. I replied, "Fairness doesn't need to be loud." Weeks later, the Data Transparency Division was fully operational. I hired 2 more people, including a young woman named Sarah, fresh out of college, her eyes bright with that same eagerness I once had. On her first day, she asked, "Ella, were you ever afraid of being misunderstood?" I smiled. I was, but then I realized, if you do what's right, the data stands with you. Truth doesn't need defenders, it just needs people who don't give up. She nodded, taking notes like she'd just learned something important. I looked at her and saw an entirely new generation, one that would never again be told juniors don't get to negotiate. By year's end, Viridian received the Best Compliance Partner of the Year award. When Rachel and I walked on stage to accept it, the applause was loud and steady. In that light, I saw faces that had once doubted me, now smiling in acknowledgement. I didn't feel proud, just warm. That night, after the ceremony, I returned to my office and turned on the small desk lamp. On the table, I placed an old photo, me, sitting in Blue Peak's conference room years ago, younger, exhausted, and invisible. I smiled and set it beside the new certificate. Then, softly, I whispered, "Thank you for not giving up, Ella." Outside, Austin glittered. Streetlights reflected off my tea, turning the surface to gold. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply. No fear, no resentment. Just the calm of someone who had walked through the dark and stood in the light, not to punish anyone, but to reclaim fairness for herself. I stood by the window, watching Austin's skyline shimmer on the glass. The towers rose like columns of living data, their lights flickering upward in sequence. Each window told a story of effort, disappointment, or the quiet persistence of belief. And I thought, somewhere out there, there are people like the old me, those junior staffers carrying the weight of entire systems no one notices. If you're hearing this after a long day, maybe tired the way I once was, I want to tell you something. Don't let anyone convince you your worth depends on a title. Every line of code you write, every report you finish, every small act of integrity unseen, each leaves a trace. Sooner or later, the data of your life will return the result you deserve. I smiled, touching the cool glass where my reflection met the city lights. Maybe you're in another city, another office, or just driving home right now. But if you've ever been dismissed, ever been told you don't deserve a seat at the table, this story is for you. Because sometimes, the strongest answer to being underestimated isn't a shout. It's quiet work, letting the light speak for you.